I think in the West, particularly in the United States, our problem is with moderation. Nobody can do anything in moderation. It's just not a thing that we do here. So it's like, okay, cannabis is legal. Let's smoke it everywhere on the bus and the boat and the train. Let's smoke it twice on schoolyards and backyards. And you're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Whoa, I'm picking my kid up from school. I don't need to smell 4 kinds of like Cali weed. Like, I'm cool. Like, I've been to Jamaica. I've hung out with the Russ. Like, I get the whole thing, but let's take it a little easy. Let's bring it down a bit. And I kind of feel like that may be the case with a lot of this other stuff, right? If people just kind of did it like a little more on the down low, a little bit more conservative, hired people like you to kind of guide them and did it in a way where it was around community, I think that's cool. But
welcome to Modern Enlightenment, a sanctuary for your soul, where we'll go on a path of personal and spiritual development. I'm Austin Mao.
And I'm Chuchu Wang. We are your companions on this journey of self-discovery and spiritual connection.
Join us as we delve into the fusion of modern psychotherapy, neuroscience, psychospirituality, and shamanic plant sacrament ceremonies, exploring the transformative potential of psychedelics for the mind, body, and spirit.
Our mission is to guide you to a place of profound awareness where emotions can be felt.
Together, let's illuminate the way to a brighter, more enlightened existence.
Modern Enlightenment, where your journey to inner peace begins.
Welcome to another episode of Modern Enlightenment. I'm here with Shaahin Cheyene. Super excited to be with this gentleman here. Shaahin created Herbal Ecstasy in the 90s, which did over $1 billion in revenue, published Ecstasy magazine, which had over 300,000 circulation, the largest magazine publication in the psychedelic space, got into nootropics, took a company public, has been around the psychedelic space for 20, 30 years, including with OGs like Terence McKenna and the Shulgins, etc. So we're here to hear some of your wisdom, some of your life experience, and really this like intersection of drugs becoming medicine, becoming sacrament. And just thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, man. Look, you and I were talking just before, and we were kind of talking about the old days. And now I'm at a place where I'm focused more on business and entrepreneurship. And I don't espouse the use of anything, so we can, kind of come out with that. But I think if something moves you forward in life and there's certain blocks, there are paths around that using natural medicine. I come from a line of herbal doctors and herbal medicine purveyors and people having to do with herbal medicine from Iran. And we understand very well, particularly in the East, Eastern culture, the importance of plants as medicine. So I'm totally down with that. I think like back in the day, I always had like a love-hate relationship with, I think the psychedelics community was very different back in the day, Austin. And I was friends with this guy, Terence McKenna, who we talked about. And Terence was much more liberal with his beliefs. He didn't really feel that the quote unquote sacraments were exclusive to anybody. He's like, you don't need to make it into anything. You just use it. And that's what's sacred. It's your experience. It's not whatever it is, a bunch of seeds or a bunch of leaves that you're growing up and eating. I think the rest of the people differed in their opinions, right? So there were multiple camps. And I'll preface this by saying I was a teenager and I had created a company selling an alternative to ecstasy that sold over $1 billion in revenue. So I was very successful very quickly and had almost no background in any of this stuff. Just for Herbal Ecstasy, I'm talking about I had no experience in any hallucinogens or psychedelics or entheogens or any of that stuff. And Terence actually turned me on to Salvia. He said, hey, there's a stuff, Hoffman and Wasson. Wasson was like this banker. I'm sure you know who he was. He was in him and Albert Hoffman, the guy that invented LSD or discovered LSD, however you want to put it, went out to Mexico and they saw that the locals were chewing the stuff, right? But they didn't know the plant was really mysterious. It only grew in the wild. Nobody could get it to grow in any other setting. Nobody knew where it came from. They just saw that some of the locals, the Mazatecans, would be chewing on it. And that's how they had this ritual. So they brought it back to the US and then nothing happened to it for years and years. And I wrote a book on this way back in the day. I was in a couple movies about it, a couple documentaries where they interviewed me. So fast forward to the 90s, I meet Terence McKenna and he's like, dude, I love Herbal Ecstasy. I know people are poo-pooing it, but it's awesome. Thank you so much. And I had another product called Magic Mushrooms that was like Herbal Ecstasy, but we had some fly agaric in it. It's the one mushroom that was legal. So we had like a, I don't know, like a homeopathic version of it, probably mostly bullshit, except for the herbal ingredients that worked really well. And we were selling millions of dollars. And Terrence loved it all. It was all amazing. It was like in mushroom bottles. It was a whole scene, right? We had created a movement around these alternative herbal supplements that people were taking instead of taking more serious stuff. And Terrence turned me on to Salvia divinorum, and he said, hey, go look for it. The story gets kind of long, and there is some government involvement in there. We had some mysterious characters show up. And again, I write about it in that book. I think that book's out of print. But we had mysterious characters show up. We happened to get a supply. I literally was bringing back the first shipments of it through the airport in trash bags, and nobody knew what it was. It wasn't illegal. They had to let it through. And that's how it all started. We started extracting it here in the US. And obviously the extract had a much bigger effect. And that started going. It grew to close to 30,000 stores. And that's how Salvia was popularized. Now it's illegal. And by the way, I think it's the worst drug ever. Like if anybody wants to do anything, like that is not the one to do, in my opinion.
Wow. Okay. Something I'm getting immediately is you've really been around the block in terms of the psychotropics and sort of the mainstream of hallucinogens, mind-altering substances since the early 90s. And you keep using this word back in the day. And it's kind of crazy to think about how the 90s are, quote unquote, back in the day for you and for me, right? Someone like Terence McKenna or Zach Cleary, who was also on our podcast, would be like back in the day was the 50s and 60s, right?
Right.
And it seems like what back in the day you are speaking to is what many would call the quote unquote dark ages of psychedelics that you were playing in at a legal level. And in fact, in some ways discovering or inventing and certainly importing things that ultimately would get more regulated. Right.
Yeah. I mean, dude, Terrence told me about ayahuasca. I was hanging out with him. This guy, Paul Stamets, you probably know him. He's a mushroom guy. He's grown an amazing company and he's been on Joe Rogan. And he got super famous now. But back then he wasn't. And we were all in Mexico at the pyramids. And I was the kid that invented herbal ecstasy. And they were experimenting with this stuff. They had this Italian guy who was doing iboga. Very interesting drug, by the way. That's one of the ones that I think probably has the potential for curing addiction. So as far as like a medicine, I think that one is probably one of the most incredible things that are out there. But, in the 60s, they banned everything and they just looked up literally in a book, what's hallucinogenic, and they just banned it. And that was like, cool, banned. So I think, there's a lot of room for that stuff. But the guys and then coming out of, so you had the 1950s, right? Everybody has a white picket fence, 1.5 kids, 1.5 dogs, right? So this is pure like lives of like amazingness until they realized that it wasn't. And then you had the 60s pop up, and the 60s was kind of a rebellion towards that. So that's when hallucinogens started going around. People started doing LSD. People started doing that stuff. And then you had, the 70s, which the drugs ramped up, the 80s, which was all about people were doing stimulants like cocaine. And you started seeing more and more people doing the opiates. And the late 80s, early 90s were about ecstasy. And a good part of the early 90s. And by the way, anyone that's interested, I wrote a book on this. It's a best-selling book called Billion, How I Became King of the Thropo Cult. That's on Amazon. There's an audiobook. There's a film coming out in a year or two. Paris Hilton's company, 1110 Productions, has bought the rights to it, and they're putting the film out soon, I hope, or going to produce it soon and then put it out. But out of that came a need for ecstasy. The supply of ecstasy dried up in the 90s. And I stepped in as a kid and I was like, hey, what if I came up with an alternative to this that was herbal, that was natural, that people could use, still have a good time, but nobody could get in trouble for it, nobody could get hurt. And that's what Herbal Ecstasy arose from. It was kind of the 90s, right when ecstasy was kind of on its way out and other stuff was coming in. We caught that space in the middle and did about $1 billion in revenue. And all the while, I had never done a single drug, never smoked cannabis, never did any of that stuff. It was way later, way later until I met Terence and met those guys. I was like, this is kind of interesting. I think I'll give some of it a try. And I tried all that. So he was big into DMT And somebody had brought this 5-MeO DMT, which I think is a DMT analog that just way too strong. I think some of these guys, I think to myself, man, some of these guys can really handle that. And I'm not one of those guys, having a grip on reality. And some of that stuff tears you out so hard and so fast that I think it's suited only to a very specific type of person. You must have a very good tolerance to it, right? Because you do that stuff all the time, right?
I mean, so interestingly, a lot of people don't know this about me, but I sit as a participant in a psychedelic ceremonial container, maybe around once a year.
Oh,
but
really?
As a minister for ceremonial, I serve medicine, I serve sacraments 1 to 2 retreats a month. And so the path that we teach is you do medicine so you don't need it anymore, right? I forget who said it, once you hear the call, hang up the phone, right?
No, that's powerful.
What's so interesting is I'm hearing this juxtaposition because recently we interviewed Rick Doblin on this podcast. And just after the FDA ruling that denied MDMA after phase 3 clinical trials. And Rick was, one of the things that I found really interesting that Rick shared, he's been at this for 38 plus years. And when he decided to put kind of all the chips into MDMA, it was watching psilocybin, DMT, et cetera, get scheduled. He's like, okay, MDMA is not yet scheduled. As a public policy PhD and somebody very interested in psychedelics and a student of Stanislav Grof, I'm going to work on making this legal. So something that interesting that he said that he believes it's unethical to legalize and provide something like MDMA without the therapy. And I've observed it myself when people take psychedelic substances, the content that can arise if they have a significant amount of trauma in their system, it promotes that content arising, right? And if you don't have the proper guidance and support to meet that content, it could re-traumatize the individual because our bodies, our psyche has suppressed that content for a reason. Yes. So imagine, a combat veteran taking MDMA and feeling a degree of safety to be able to relive in a traumatic experience, but then not having the support once that arises.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, it seems like Terence, from your description, Terence McKenna was all for the prolific use of these substances. You created companies that made widely available and very successfully made available substances that helped induce altered state of consciousness, in a legal way. I'm curious what your take is on ethics and morals of people using substances without guidance or therapy.
Yeah, so the stuff that we had was relatively mild in comparison to stuff that you would take. There's nothing all organic that you could take that's legal that's going to be like LSD or it's going to be like ayahuasca, right? We sold ayahuasca back in the day, Banisteriopsis caapi, the root, but we didn't sell the DMT component to it, right? So presumably somebody could take it. There are ayahuasqueros in the Amazon that use just Banisteriopsis, but extract it in a certain way and they mix it with tobacco and some other stuff. But the stuff that we sold, like Herbal Ecstasy, was really just a good time. You would take it and party. And by the way, I think Rick is right. I mean, it's such a bummer that real ecstasy is illegal. It's one of those things. Again, I don't espouse the use of any drugs to anybody, but I feel like anytime you take anyone who takes real stuff, and I don't know how easy it is. I haven't been in that world for many years, but you take it and you're just like, oh my God, how could there be war? How could you argue with somebody? It's one of those things where you're like, if everybody took that, the world would be a different place. It really has that potential, right? And Herbal Ecstasy wasn't that. It did not have the empathetic, heart-melting effects, but it did have a lot of the physical effects. And there was some other mixture of herbs in there where people did have a unique experience, certainly not the same as the stuff that Rick is promoting. I don't know. I mean, I think we have to be very careful. What's sacred? Sacred is whatever you decide is sacred, right? It's whatever me and you decide is sacred. So it doesn't matter what the ingredients are. That stuff is just a bunch of herbs extracted, mixed in a little thing, and everybody hits a cup. There's nothing sacred or unsacred about it, right? It's the emotions and the feelings that we attach to it. With that said, taking any of that stuff, like you said, it can open up a whole world. And if you're not in the right set and setting. So I remember that was a very big thing. People were really experiencing and experimenting with that back in the day. I mean, if you don't have that, it could be very harmful. And that genie can't be put back in the bottle. I'll tell you a funny story. So there was no tourism back in those days. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to go on an expedition. Let's go. Somebody told me about a tribe. We met a tour guide who was part of this tribe, but the tribe had not been met with the West. They had been uncontacted in the Amazon, right? In this area called Tres Fronteras, which is where the three countries come together. It's like Brazil, Peru, and I forget what the other one was. So we started off there and we went out for about 4 hours on these little boats, right? And we end up in this hut. The guys are there. The tribe that had not been contacted, a few of those guys came. They'd never seen anybody from the West before. So this was like first communication with them. They had nothing Western on them at all. It was like beads and, arrows, and they were a little aggressive at first. And I was like, all right, I don't think we can say no once we become friends to them, to whatever they do. So we ended up in this hut, and I've got pictures of all this. I think I have video of all this. And the guy's putting a tube in my nose. I had no idea what is shooting up. I mean, I think I remember Terence telling me about what that stuff is, but he wasn't there. The guy shot the thing in my nose. Poof. And I was just like, oh, and I was going for like, I don't know, 30, 40 years. And turns out it was like 4 minutes. And I came back and I was like, what the fuck was that? I was definitely don't want to do that again. Thank you very much. Thank you for not killing me, but no thanks to any more of that. It hurts too. It burns, when they shoot. You ever have that stuff?
That was Hape, wasn't it? Right?
Okay. Yeah. There was a lot of things. And so then.
Just for the listeners, I assume that's Hape, and that's powderized tobacco snuff that is shot up the nose, but you don't actually snort it. It just gets held there. And snorting it creates a really bad time. But yeah.
It was a little more than tobacco. So it was definitely more than tobacco. It was some seed. There was some seed that they were mashing up. Trying to think, it was a long time ago. I think it was called Yopo. Is there something called Yopo? YOPO? We should Google it and find out.
Okay.
But I remember that. So that happened. And then we continue to go down the river, different tribes. And there's one who's like, hey, man, you want to try some of this stuff? I'm asking my guide. Now, remember, they don't speak English or Spanish. My guide speaks a little Spanish and almost no English. And I speak a little Spanish and English. So trying to communicate with these tribes is really like the most primal like communication. They each have their own language. And so they bring out this thing. It's got like a monkey skull hanging from it. It's like an old bottle, right? And inside is this like brown goo. And he's like, hey, try some of this. There was no ceremony. There was no singing songs or anything. He's like, do you want to try some? I was like, sure, can't really say no. It was a very aggressive tribe, I should mention. And later we learned that there was some cannibalism involved in this particular tribe, not of tourists because they never met them, but of neighboring tribes. And in fact, the day when we came, they had a jaguar that they had killed and were carrying it. Also, no like sacred ceremony, no like reverence for the animal. They were just, they killed the jaguar and were carrying it in. I think they're going to eat it and take its skin or whatever. Skin and teeth and stuff for decoration. So I drink this stuff. I'm like, thank God the stuff didn't work. Right. It was like an hour goes by, nothing. We get back on the boat to go back. And it's starting to get dark. And I start to think to myself, wow, I'm feeling really good. I wonder if this stuff's gonna hit. And I look down in the middle of the Amazon, the river. And inside this river, you got piranhas, because that's what we ate when we were there, right? You got those big anaconda snakes. You got the little, crocodile looking things. Everything in there will kill you, basically. They got the things that'll swim up through your urethra. I definitely did not want to go swimming there. The boat starts sinking, and the guide is using his shoe to start taking water out of the boat. The motor stops because the whole thing gets submerged, the back end of this boat. We're in the middle of this Amazon river, and the stuff starts to hit me.
Oh, wow.
Full on. I had never had it before. And now I've got to navigate this experience on this little boat late at night you see all these eyes pop up, right? It's the little alligator crocodile things in the water. Because when, the sun goes down, you ever been to the Amazon? Of course you have, right?
I actually haven't been to the Amazon.
Okay, so you got to go if you want to have a crazy experience. But the lights go down. It's very dark. There's no lights anywhere. And these little eyes shoot up. And you're like, oh, that's kind of nice, right? Because if you flash a light, you'll see they're reflective. It's all caimans and crocodiles. And if you drop like a piece of chicken in the water, it's about 3 seconds, it'll be completely devoured by piranhas. So that was my first ayahuasca experience for you right there. We managed to get back. This guy was amazing. He actually jumped out of the boat and swam the boat to shore. That's what an incredible guy. He had a machete.
He also on ayahuasca?
No, he wouldn't do it. They've got all kinds of rules for the guides and the people who interact with the outside world. So he absolutely wouldn't do it. But they wanted to share it with me. And it was a rather intense experience.
Wow. What's interesting is we just had somebody on this podcast who is an alumnus of Ceremonia. And after coming through this retreat, which was her first time using a psychedelic in an intentional, ceremonial container, later would take a bunch of founders and entrepreneurs to the Amazon. And it was like a high ticket item. They visited some tribes, did ayahuasca, that whole 9 yards. But now it's at the level where you can book a tour for this kind of thing, right?
Oh, yeah.
And it sounds like for you, this was way early on where you were first contact, you were first contact for these tribes. So, what I heard offline is that you're out of the business of herbal products now. And in fact, focusing on helping people like me share our stories. And I'm curious, as you hear these stories of what many consider to be this psychedelic renaissance that we're in right now, what's your take on this? Ayahuasca, you can do ayahuasca, in LA now. You can find a local quote unquote shaman, which is probably going to be, a white guy who did a few ceremonies that could be someone like that ordered ayahuasca off the internet. That definitely exists right now. And so what's your take on popularization?
Yeah, I have no judgment on it. I think in the West, particularly in the United States, our problem is with moderation. Nobody can do anything in moderation. It's just not a thing that we do here. So it's all of a sudden it's okay, cannabis is legal. Let's smoke it everywhere on the bus and the boat and the train. Let's smoke it twice on schoolyards and backyards. And you're like, whoa. I'm picking my kid up from school. I don't need to smell 4 kinds of Cali weed. I'm cool. I've been to Jamaica. I've hung out with the Rust. I get the whole thing, but let's take it a little easy. Let's bring it down a bit. And I kind of feel like that may be the case with a lot of this other stuff, right? If people just kind of did it a little more on the down low, a little bit more conservative, hired people like you to kind of guide them and did it in a way where it was around community, I think that's cool. But I'm always careful, Austin, when anything becomes a religion, right? And I'm saying that in the pure context of religion. What I've always believed is that any of these things in and of themselves are the thing. There's no interpretation needed, right? When you take that stuff, I don't think anybody needs to interpret your experience. It's like dreams, right? Do you need somebody to interpret your dreams? Okay, people like that, but it's mostly bullshit. You can find 50 books interpreting a single dream. So the thing is the experience. And I think this is one of the things that, Terence never said it, but I think this is why he differed from a lot of the other people in the psychedelics community back in the day, was because the thing is the experience. And I feel that way with religion too. Hey man, you're pulled to Christ, you're pulled to Muhammad, you're pulled to Buddha, whatever it is, right? The experience is the experience. Why do you need to have an intermediary translating it for you? You don't, right? But like I said, if it brings community, I think that's great. I think if people have community in specific cases where people have trauma, people have certain issues that Western medicine has just thrown its hands up and been oh, you have a degenerative disease. I've had multiple doctors when I went for certain eczema, they're you have a degenerative disease. It'll just get worse. And I was okay, well, that's your opinion, not my opinion. I'm going to do this other stuff and see how it works. And I did, and it worked. And I go back to them and they're oh, well, there's always an outlier. I'm dude, I don't care about your, whatever your opinion is. I want to know how I can become that outlier. So I think if you're one of those people where you need to heal trauma, I think it's definitely hallucinogens can be an accelerator, right? But again, you got to know how much to take. Something like mushrooms, for example, the difference between having an amazing experience and having an absolute total fucking freak out, and I've had both, it can be very small. And I think in these traditional cultures, that's traditionally the role of the shaman, right? He provides whatever the sacrament is. He tells you how much you're going to take, and then he guides you through that experience. I was up in Mexico. I made a film in the early 2000s called Serpent in the Sun. And Serpent in the Sun, it was called Serpent in the Sun, Tales of an Aztec Apprentice. I think you can still get it online. Not on Netflix, it's on Amazon now, I think, or Apple. You can get it on Apple Movie. And what we did was we went to Mexico and we followed the last living Aztec medicine man throughout Mexico for like 6 years when he took an apprentice. And through their traditions, we hung out with the Aztec people and we made a film about this. And through that film, through that experience, I really was able to see through the lens of indigenous people. And he hated being called that. He's just like, what do you mean? What is indigenous? He's like, that's an insulting term. He didn't like the term shaman either because shaman is a Mongolian word. He's like, I'm not freaking Mongolian. I'm like, okay, what do we call you? He's like, just medicine man, just medicine man. And by the way, people don't know this. There's a very live and vibrant culture throughout the Americas, throughout Mexico in particular, that is active. And the descendants of these original healers are still there practicing their original medicine. But a lot of them aren't on the internet. A lot of them you can only find by going there and actually find. People don't know this, particularly with peyote that you guys use. There's a lot of tribes that are still using that out there as a sacrament. There's tribes that use tobacco, and they break them off into, there's like colored tribes, right? So there's red, white, black, and blue. So there's 4 directions, 4 tribes of the Mexica, which is what the Aztecs really were. And each one has a different thing. 3 of the 4 don't use anything. I believe the white, if I'm not misspeaking, after 6 years of hanging out with these guys, only the white tribe is allowed to use peyote as a sacrament. But I think a lot of the stuff, if used right, can bring about a result. Like the way you do it, it sounds like you approach it in a very methodic way where you use it as a tool for healing, really, is what it sounds like. And I'm all for that. I think that's amazing for us to like look at that, to explore that. I mean, of course, that should be legal and people should have access to that. But I think people that like kind of do it at Burning Man and, you know, are like partying with this stuff, I don't know. I'm not sure it brings you up in life when you use it like that. I got no judgment on it, but I don't think it makes you a better person from what I've seen.
There are a few things that I'm connecting with you on. Like, we distinguish between a drug, medicine, and sacrament, right? A drug is, I'm recreational using it. And I should say, for me, it's based on your intention. Medicine is healing. That's what medicine is for. When you take an antibiotic, it is for a physical level of healing to promote your body to heal itself. And sacrament is for communion with something bigger than us, right? Or bigger than my human flesh experience of myself. And, you know, my interpretation of what you're sharing and where I connect to it is that what's important is that in a spiritual experience, the person experiencing it has full agency and sovereignty to define their experience or not, right? Because I believe what happens in a transpersonal or psychedelic or spiritual experience, which doesn't have to be induced by a psychedelic, it could be induced by hyperventilation, aka breath work, can be induced by fasting, starvation, can be induced by group spiritual experiences or meditation, right? What happens is, I believe the mind attempts to make form of the formless experience. AKA, I'm feeling something in my body, I'm feeling something in my, and it could be my physical body or my energy body. And then my mind says, it is this image, or it is this label, or it is this deity, right?
Yeah.
And what we try to promote in ceremony is to get out of the labels and go deeper into the actual inner sensation of the thing, right? Now, the labels, I think, are convenience. Like, I can say to you, hypothetically, let's say, you know, my mom is very Christian, and I can say to her, you know, I had an experience of Christ consciousness. And she would be like, okay, I get what that means because I've read about it and she's had that experience herself, you know? And so there's a convenience in being able to communicate that, just like there's a convenience in communicating in English to you the word love, right? I say the word love to you instead of blah, 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 blah. And you're like, oh yeah, I know what love is, right?
Yeah.
But that's a very subjective experience for you, what love is. What you felt as love is deeply personal to you. There are many certain qualities of love. What I felt as love is deeply personal to me. And yet at the same time, we can look at each other and be like, I know what love is. You know what love is? You know what love is. Yeah, we can say that, right? I think when we get stuck at the word, stuck in the ideas, that's where it really creates division. And one thing that I've really worked around a lot, being around many facilitators. I say I know 100 facilitators, I trust 6, of the psychedelic space. It's how do we hold space for other people without impressing upon them our beliefs, right? To create room for the individual to discover for themselves.
That's right.
And since we're swapping stories, I have a funny one that there's a participant. I was exiting the bathroom, right, as I'm facilitating a ceremony, and I bump into him, and he says to me, Austin, should I go to the bathroom? And in that moment, I'm thinking to myself, well, you walked all the way over here, and of course you should. But what I said to him is, only you know. No. And it sounds like such a simple thing, but that was extraordinarily impactful for his life, because he's like, oh, yeah, I do know. And what that did is it had far-reaching ramifications that he's still integrating now, because he's listened to his inner self instead of listening to me or someone outside of himself say, hey, yeah, of course you should do that, right? And that's the interesting thing about this work. It's that, when I think about the ethics of using substances, guided or unguided, I personally do believe there is value in doing psychedelics recreationally, right? And I share in my stories, I've done it 100 times recreationally before I started using it ceremonially. But I also think that, to your point, one needs to have a level of self-cognition and moderation to be able to make sure they're not falling into the trap of a different kind of addiction. It may not be a biochemical addiction, but there's a Zen teacher named Adyashanti that calls this spiritual addiction. It's like addiction to the high of being in the state of, a mind-altered state or a substance-altered state of spirituality, which most spiritual teachers share is the most incredible sensation known to consciousness, known to human, right?
So, Austin, why do angels fly?
Why do angels fly?
Because they take themselves lightly. And that's from Alan Watts. One of the most amazing things, by the way, if anybody here hasn't listened to Alan Watts, please do yourself a favor and go on Spotify and listen to Alan Watts. There's all kinds of people mixing Alan Watts to all types of really great dub music and trip hop. And Alan Watts was largely responsible. He's a British guy. He started off as a priest and dropped out of that and decided to go into Eastern wisdom, and really was responsible for bringing Zen to the West in a digestible manner. But he talks about that. And the reason why I use that is because what I'm hearing you say, like the hit I'm getting from what you're saying, is don't take yourself so fucking seriously. Like people take all the shit so seriously because, I use it this way and do this and do that. If you're going to do some stuff, you do some stuff. The experience is the experience, right? And it is what it is. The benefits that you get from it are what you get from it. But I think it's when we take ourselves seriously, when you take that shit so seriously, that it becomes, like you said, another addiction. And that's where the problem is. So very astute observation by you. I think that's probably why you're so good and so sought after for what you do.
Yeah, I love this. Not take yourself so seriously. I call it irreverent reverence.
Yeah.
Because, in my path to be a more and more skilled facilitator, I used to take myself so fucking seriously. Always wearing white and flowy robes and, being very spiritual voices. And now I think humor is, if you listen to Ram Dass or Joseph Goldstein or Alan Watts, they were hilarious. Yeah. I remember, so the quote unquote Bible for our church is a book called Letting Go by David Hawkins. And he created this thing called Map of Consciousness. And hearing him talk in front of Harvard, this guy was cracking jokes all the time. Just this gregarious, funny, elderly man,
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we're really missing in spiritual pursuits now. There's a lot of judgment when people laugh, right?
Yeah.
And I think that there's a guru that says holding paradox is one of the highest states of consciousness. And in order to hold that paradox, you need laughter.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll tell you another funny story. So during the 90s, I went on this whole thing where I was big in the personal development world and going to every guru and self-help guy. And I met a dude who I really liked his books. We became very close friends. He was a huge guru. They called him the guru to the gurus. So everybody, Deepak, Wayne Dyer, all those people went to him as their guru. Tony Robbins, everybody went to this guy.
Who is this?
And so he would go on stage, and he had a pretty big following himself. He would go on stage. And I remember one of his first seminars that I went to, there must have been several hundreds of people there in the room. And he shows up drunk, smoking a cigarette. And even in the 90s, that was like a little crazy. And he was just there. He was obviously drunk. And the people there were like looking, going, what the fuck? We came to a money seminar. Like, who is this guy? We came to this master money, whatever his thing was. In those days, he'd written a best-selling book on it. And people started leaving. And so he emptied out like 3/4 of the room, and there was, maybe 50 people left. And he waited a second. He goes, okay, so now the people that aren't ready are gone. Let's get on with it. And then he started the real seminar, because that was what he was. He was like, he's like, they're just taking themselves too fucking seriously. He goes, and when they're buried, vegetables will grow because they all have carrots in their ass. And he was funny. He was a British guy. He was a British metaphysician. And, he was funny and irreverent like that. And I think that's one of the things I learned, never took himself that seriously.
That feels like a big paradox in itself, right? Because we're in this midst of a psychedelic renaissance. There are academic studies, scientific papers written. It seems like every month a new paper is coming out on ketamine, on LSD, on psilocybin, so on and so forth. Clinical trials for MDMA or psilocybin, Oregon, Colorado legalizing, municipalities legalizing, like it's coming and it's serious. There's lots of therapists. There's lots of people getting licensed, and we're going to be licensing a lot of people too. And at the same time, I think the great paradox is, there is an extent to which these medicines help, even without support. I really believe that. I don't know if I fully agree with Rick I think it's unethical if we legalize without the need for support, but I don't cast judgment on people using substances without support, right? I would prefer that they do, especially if it's their first time. But, there's even a law, the federal law, that says you can try anything going through the FDA. And one of the things that Rick was speaking to is the desire to modify that law so they'll allow trying things going through the FDA that are scheduled, which is the one limitation right now, right? AKA they can try psilocybin or try MDMA as it's going through the FDA process, at your own risk. So I think that there is this room for people trying things out, as you did. You went to the Amazon and you tried ayahuasca from a monkey skull on a boat that was about to sink. And at the same time, the paradox is like, also there's room for this being taken seriously. Real health ramifications, real medical ramifications, real psychospiritual ramifications, right? And it's like, where do we find, I had an ayahuasca ceremony myself where it came to me, it's like, balance is how we hold paradox in the 3D world, right? In the spiritual world with non-duality, I can hold light and dark, good and bad at the same time. But in the 3D world, I got to be balanced between my light and dark, be balanced between my good and bad, balance between my humor and the cosmic comedy and the great tragedy of life and the beauty.
Here's the other thing with it. And what you're saying makes a lot of sense. I remember I had this whole phase where I was doing the European hallucinogens tour of my life. And I don't know if many people do that, but there are people that are practicing druids. I don't know if people know this, and they make all kinds of concoctions, similar to ayahuasca, actually, that you take in a forest with guys wearing fox bear things on their head, which I've done. Now, I remember I was in a particular forest in Ireland with people who practiced druidism. Maybe they were druids. Beautiful place, by the way, to have these kinds of experiences. And I remember having all these epiphanies. Like, Austin, I was like, dude, I'm looking behind the curtain now. Everything makes sense. I understand the era of my life. I understand the path going forward. You need me to solve global geopolitics. I can do that. Making money is super easy. Like, it was there. It was the pot of gold. I had it all. And then the stuff wore off. And do you know how much of that stuff I took back?
How much?
Zero. It's like the monkey with his hands in the cookie jar, right?
Totally.
You can't take it back. You can't take it back. And I don't know anybody who's brought stuff back from there. Yeah, okay, so you can have the experience. You can, if you got trauma, you can like heal that. I would say that stuff that's on this side that is healing you, not stuff on that side. That's just an experience, like a facilitator. You just can't bring it back. And I've seen people get trapped on the other side and they think they're bringing stuff back and they're not. And that's unfortunate when that happens. And it can happen if it's done incorrectly and you take the wrong stuff. I've seen people go to the jungle and meet crooked shamans. Apparently, there are many of them that just want to take your money to let you try stuff. And some of that stuff, for example, any of the daturas, you can forever be gone in those worlds and like to never come back, to never be the same again. So I think to your point and to your question earlier, Like when you weigh that, like, dude, I'm a 50-year-old man. I've worked through a lot of issues. I've been around like a lot of places, 49. Like the benefits and the risks for me, like really aren't there. And like the parting isn't there. But if somebody else wants to do it, like, dude, so much better than so many other things that are out there, right? Like all the stuff that people are taking, all the opioids that people are taking, those are terrible drugs. All the like cocaine and like all those crazy stimulants that people are taking, speed, all that stuff, like the stuff that is around in the psychedelics community is fairly benign. Like, I don't think anyone's ever like really addicted to that stuff. Not really, right? You can get addicted to the experience, to like all the stuff we're talking about, but there's nobody that goes through withdrawal if they did. The definition of addiction is the presence of withdrawal symptoms when you try to quit. That's what indicates addiction. So I don't think there's anybody who's addicted. It's not, for a good part of the experience, pleasant. Like I don't describe it as pleasant particularly.
Uncomfortable until it becomes blissful, usually for most people.
Yeah. From somebody who's like deeply experienced with the stuff back in the day, I mean, certainly not the way that you are, I mean, for me, I look at that balance, right? But here's a question for you. I was thinking this was a question that came to me. So why do you think, if this stuff is relatively benign, right? Okay, so we know we've got drugs, like you got stimulants like cocaine and speed. You've got terrible things that people use like heroin. I mean, outside of, the use of opioids for pain control, right? With a medical setting. The other stuff out there is pretty terrible. The fentanyl crisis right now is like destroying America. Why do you think they're so intent on banning psychedelics and restricting things like MDMA when for the most part it seems like they're benign? Do you think, okay, so this is my question for you because you're an interesting dude. Do you think there's a bunch of like Illuminati men in black sitting around somewhere going like, you know what? Like we don't want them to look behind the curtain. We're going to just ban all this stuff. Or do you think it's maybe a method of control, a method of population mass control of saying, hey, we don't want the population to have these experiences. We want to control the experience that they have. Or do you think they're like genuinely worried about being a public health issue?
I think there's an economic reason and I think there's a spiritual reason. Economically, I think first, it's really hard to make money with psychedelics because the fact is when you take psychedelics, you need less of it as a medication, right? And so for a pharmaceutical company, I mean, it's the very opposite of their business model, right? They want you to get on Ozempic or Adderall and need it for the rest of your life. Then you're a great customer, right? Your lifetime value as a customer is tens of thousands of dollars, right? And so the science of the effectiveness of psychedelics is it's so wildly effective. I mean, it was the most studied drug in psychiatry that in the 50s and 60s that it potentially can eliminate 90% of all psychiatric care and completely reinvent the model. That's very destabilizing to that industry. So I think there's an economic reason. There's a political reason. A lot of people don't realize that in the 60s when it was scheduled, it was because Nixon wanted to disenfranchise minority voters. And so he lumped in psychedelics with cannabis so that African Americans and Hispanics would be put into jail so they wouldn't vote for his opposition. I mean, that's a really horrific reason. But I also believe spiritually, and this is totally my belief, is that we're in a very interesting time. I think there's a reason, and this is my woo-woo side coming out, there's a reason why AI, why climate change, why the effects of climate change, they're all happening at the same time as psychedelics is going through its renaissance. It's because humanity needs tools to be able to meet the coming challenges so that we can move from separateness to oneness. And in order to hold tools, like in Buddhism, it says you suffer so that you can muster the courage to say, I've had enough and I want to do something different. And that's when you start going into introspection, right? There's going to be a lot of suffering. There already is a lot of suffering in the world, and there's going to be more of it. AI displacing 95% of human jobs by 2035. There's going to be a ton of suffering as the economic gap between the haves and have-nots widens. How is humanity going to compete? And I imagine it's going to compete at a level where computers can't compete, which is to say at a level of consciousness, right? A level of spirituality, a level of creativity that is inaccessible by ones and zeros. So in order to get that, I think the universe, again, it's my opinion, the universe isn't just going to say, hey, here it is on a silver platter. We must earn it. And we must earn it through integrity. We must earn it through kind of the conversations we're having now. right? If it's so easy for us all to get enlightened by taking a pill, we would have long been there. There's got to be a challenge, a friction for us to push through. And it's not pushing through willpower, it's pushing through courage and love and commitment. So that's what I think, that's the direction we're going. I think that's the reason why it is so challenging. And when we look back, if you look back into your life, and then you also look back into the humanity, right? Things that seemed like big obstacles were actually big gifts. The biggest scientific inventions that we've had that saved a ton of lives came from wars. When we were in a world war, that's where we invented space travel. That's where we invented antibiotics. That's where we invented, rail lines that crisscrossed across continents. And so in the moment when we're stuck in the suck, it seems like, oh my God, this is terrible. But when we zoom out enough in time horizons, we're like, wow, that was such a gift. And I think that's where we are now. It's like, okay, this stuff is being used in many different ways, some of it not integrous. There's lots of challenges from big pharma, so on and so forth. And at the same time, it is demanding of us a level of rigor to use these substances, in a profound way, right? To honor it as sacrament. That's my opinion. Well, Shaahin, this has been so special. And I just want to say, the perspective that you bring is really refreshing. We have a lot of scientists and a lot of political activists and whatnot on this podcast. And having created a $1 billion company around mind-altering substances, being pioneers and, going to Amazonian tribes, et cetera, what your perspective brings is this continuity from what the quote unquote dark ages of psychedelics to where we are now. So I'm curious if there's anything that you want to leave audiences with, how people can find you, what you're doing now. You've named a bunch of books, documentaries, et cetera, but
Sure. If you guys want to hear more about the Herbal Ecstasy story, go to Billion, How I Became King of the Thrill Pill Cult. It's by me, Shaahin Cheyene. That's going to be on Audible. You can also get it on Amazon if you want to read paper books. That's available there. The film will be out in a couple years, so the book's a good place to start. But at the end of the day, Austin, it all comes back to telling your story. And that's what I'm doing here. And that's what my focus is now, getting people like yourself and other thought leaders in different spaces, particularly in the space that you're in, to have a platform where they can go out there and tell their story on other people's shows. And my latest company, which you so graciously are one of our favorite clients of, is Podcast Cola. And anybody that's interested in being on great shows like this one. And again, it comes back to what we're talking about, the stories that you tell other people, the stories that you tell yourself. But if you have a product or service, if you're a coach, an author, if you have business and you want to promote it, there's no better way, podcast enlightenment. So check us out at podcastcola.com. We get people just like you, just like Austin, and thousands of others booked on amazing podcasts in every niche out there. It's podcastcola.com. And if you guys want to learn more about me or my story, see me there.
Thank you, Shaahin. This has been wonderful. Love you,
Thanks,
bro.
Austin. Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Modern Enlightenment. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to check out our website, subscribe to our online community, and check out our social media links in the show notes for more resources and updates.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to stay connected with our upcoming episodes, where we continue to explore the intersection of modern science and spiritual wisdom. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and keep shining your light.